Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Before we begin this evening, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to 4 new Patreon subscribers: Alex, Melinda, Charlotte, and Jason. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. Your help makes it possible and keeps it ad-free for everyone, and it's much appreciated. If you're interested in learning about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the show description. If you'd like to support the podcast without subscribing, you'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can leave us a one-time tip, no sign-up required. And just a reminder, everyone who supports the podcast in the month of November will be receiving a full-length, uninterrupted recording of the work we're completing tonight. That'll be a 4.5-hour recording of Boring Books for Bedtime for those nights when you just need a little something extra. So I hope you'll take the time to check out Patreon or buymeacoffee.com, and thank you so much for your support. Now, let's get to the reading. This evening we're reading the 5th and final part of The Coming of the Fairies by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of The New Revelation, The Vital Message, and Wanderings of a Spiritualist, illustrated from photographs. Copyright 1921 and 1922 by George H. Dorn Company, New York. Let's pick up where we left off. Chapter 7. Some Subsequent Cases. From the foregoing chapter, it will be clear that there was a good deal of evidence which cannot easily be brushed aside as to the existence of these little creatures before the discovery of the photographs. These various witnesses have nothing to gain by their testimony, and it is not tainted by any mercenary consideration. The same remark applies to a number of cases which were communicated to me after the appearance of the articles in the Strand. 1 or 2 were more or less ingenious practical jokes, but from the others I have selected some which appear to be altogether reliable. The gentleman whom I have already quoted under the name of Lancaster, he who was so doubtful as to the validity of the photographs, is himself a seer. He says, "Personally, I should describe fairies as being about 2 feet 6 inches to 3 feet in height, and dressed in duffel brown clothes. The nearest approach I can get to them is to say that they are spiritual monkeys. They have the active brains of monkeys, and their general instinct is to avoid mankind. But they are capable individually of becoming extremely attached to humans, or one human. But at any time they may bite you like a monkey and repent immediately afterwards. They have thousands of years of collective experience. Call it inherited memory, if you like, but no reasoning faculties. They are just Peter Pans, children who never grow up. I remember asking one of our spirit group how one could get into touch with the brownies. He replied that when you could go into the woods and call the brown rabbits to you, the other brownies will also come to you. Speaking generally, I should imagine that anyone who has had any truck with fairies must have obeyed the scriptural injunction to become as a little child, that is, He or she must be either simple or a Buddha. This last phrase is a striking one, and it is curiously confirmed by a gentleman named Matthews, writing on January 3rd, 1921, from San Antonio, Texas. He declared that his 3 daughters, now married women, could all see fairies before the age of puberty, but never after it. The fairies said to them, "We are not of the human evolution. Very few humans have ever visited us. Only old souls well advanced in evolution or in a state of sex innocence can come to us." This repeats independently the idea of Mr. Lancaster. These children seem to have gone into a trance state before they found themselves in the country of the fairies, a country of intelligent beings, very small, 12 to 18 inches high. According to their accounts, they were invited to attend banquets or celebrations, excursions on beautiful lakes, etc. Each child was able to entrance instantly. This they always did when they visited fairyland, but when the fairies came to them, which was generally in the twilight, they sat in chairs in normal state, watching them dance. The father adds, "My own children learned in this way to dance, so that at local entertainments, audiences were delighted, though they never knew from what source they learned." My correspondent does not say whether there is a marked difference between the European and the American type of fairy. No doubt, if these results are confirmed and followed up, there will be an exact classification in the future. If Bishop Leadbeater's clairvoyance can be trusted, there is, as will afterwards be shown, a very clear distinction between the elemental life of various countries, as well as many varieties in each particular country. One remarkable first-hand case of seeing fairies came from the Reverend Arnold J. Holmes. He wrote, "Being brought up in the Isle of Man, one breathed the atmosphere of superstition, if you like to call it, the simple, beautiful faith of the Manx fisherfolk, the childlike trust of the Manx girls, who to this day will not forget the bit of wood and coal put ready at the side of the fireplace in case the little people call and need a fire. A good husband is the ultimate reward, and neglect in this respect, a bad husband or no husband at all." The startling phenomena occurred on my journey from Peel Town at night to St. Mark's, where I was incumbent. After passing Sir Hall Caine's beautiful residence, Greba Castle, my horse, a spirited one, suddenly stopped dead, and looking ahead I saw amid the obscure light and misty moonbeams what appeared to be a small army of indistinct figures, very small, clad in gossamer garments. They appeared to be perfectly happy, scampering and tripping along the road, having come from the direction of the beautiful sylvan glen of Greba and St. Trinian's roofless church. The legend is that it has ever been the fairies' haunt, and when an attempt has been made on 2 occasions to put a roof on, the fairies have removed all the work during the night, and for a century no further attempts have been made. It has therefore been left to the little people who claimed it as their own. I watched spellbound, my horse half mad with fear. The little happy army then turned in the direction of Witch's Hill and mounted a mossy bank. One little man of larger stature than the rest, about 14 inches high, stood at attention until all had passed him dancing, singing with happy abandon across the valley fields towards St. John's Mount. The wide distribution of the fairies may be judged by the following extremely interesting narrative from Mrs. Hardy, the wife of a settler in the Maori districts of New Zealand. After reading about what others have seen, I am encouraged to give you an experience of my own, which happened about 5 years ago. Will you please excuse my mentioning a few domestic details connected with the story? Our home is built on the top of a ridge. The ground was leveled for some distance to allow for sites for the house, buildings, lawns, etc. The ground on either side slopes steeply down to an orchard on the left, and shrubbery and paddock on the right, bounded by the main road. One evening when it was getting dusk, I went into the yard to hang the tea towels on the clothesline. As I stepped off the veranda, I heard a sound of soft galloping coming from the direction of the orchard. I thought I must be mistaken, and that the sound came from the road, where the Maoris often gallop their horses. I crossed the yard to get the pegs, and heard the galloping coming nearer. I walked to the clothesline, and stood under it with my arms uplifted to peg the towel on the line, when I was aware of the galloping close behind me, and suddenly a little figure riding a tiny pony rode right under my uplifted arms. I looked round to see that I was surrounded by 8 or 10 tiny figures on tiny ponies like dwarf Shetlands. The little figure who came so close to me stood out quite clearly in the light that came from the window, but he had his back to it, and I could not see his face. The faces of the others were quite brown, also the ponies were brown. If they wore clothes, they were close-fitting like a child's jersey suit. They were like tiny dwarves, or children of about 2 years of age. I was very startled and called out, "Goodness, what is this?" I think I must have frightened them, for at the sound of my voice they all rode through the rose trellis across the drive and down the shrubbery. I heard the soft galloping dying away into the distance, and listened until the sound was gone, then went into the house. My daughter, who has had several psychic experiences, said to me, "Mother, how white and startled you look. What have you seen? And who were you speaking to just now in the yard?" I said, "I have seen the fairies ride." The little fairy horses are mentioned by several writers, and yet it must be admitted that their presence makes the whole situation far more complicated and difficult to understand. If horses, why not dogs? And we find ourselves in a whole new world upon the fairy scale. I have convinced myself that there is overwhelming evidence for the fairies, but I have by no means been able to assure myself of these adjuncts. The following letter from a young lady in Canada, a daughter of one of the leading citizens of Montreal, and personally known to me, is interesting on account of the enclosed photograph here reproduced. She says, "The enclosed photograph was taken this summer at Waterville, New Hampshire, with a 2A Brownie camera, portrait lens attached, by Alverda, 11 years old. The father is able, clear-headed, enthusiastic on golf and billiards, the mother on Japanese art, neither interested in psychic matters much. The child has been frail and imaginative, but sweet and incapable of deceit. The mother tells me she was with the child when the picture was taken. The mushrooms pleased the little girl, and she knelt down and photographed them. As an indication of their ordinary size, they are Amanita muscaria. There was no such figure to be seen as appears in the picture. There was no double exposure. The picture astonished them when developed. The parents guarantee its honesty, but are mystified. Do you think shadows, etc., can explain it? I think the line of the right shoulder and arm especially are too decisive to be thus brushed away. I rather agree with the writer, but it is a point which each reader can decide for himself upon examination of the photograph. It is certainly very vague after the Yorkshire examples. New Zealand would appear to be quite a fairy centre, for I have another letter from a lady in those beautiful islands, which is hardly less interesting and definite than the one already quoted. She says, I have seen fairies in all parts of New Zealand, but especially in the fern-clad gullies of the North Island. Most of my unfoldment for mediumship was carried out in Auckland, and during that time I spent hours in my garden and saw the fairies most often in the evening just after sunset. From observation, I noticed they usually lived or else appeared around the perennial plants. I saw brown fairies and green fairies, and they all had wings of a filmy appearance. I used to talk to them and ask them to make special pet plants and cuttings I put in the garden grow well, and I am sure they did by the results I got. Since I came to Sydney, I have also seen the Green Fairies. I tried an experiment last spring. I had some pheasant-eye narcissus growing in the garden. I saw the Green Fairies about them. I transplanted one of the bulbs to a pot when half grown, and took it with me when I went away for a short holiday. I asked the fairies to keep it growing. I watched it closely every evening. A green-clad fairy, sometimes 2 or 3 of them, would appear on the pot under the plant, and whatever they did to it during the night I do not know. But next morning it was very much bigger, and although transplanted, it flowered 3 weeks before those in the garden. I am now living at Rochdale, Sydney, with friends both Australians and spiritualists, and they also have seen the fairies from childhood up. I am sure animals see them. The fairies appear every evening in a little wild corner of the garden we leave for them, and our cat sits and watches them intently, but never attempts to spring at them as he does at other moving objects. If you care to make use of the information contained in this letter, you are welcome to do so. I had another interesting letter from Mrs. Roberts of Dunedin, one of the most gifted women in psychic matters whom I met during my Australian wanderings, in which she describes, as the last writer has done, the intimate connection between these elemental forms of life and the flowers, asserting that she has continually seen them tending the plants in her own garden. From Ireland, I received several fairy stories which seem to be honestly told, even if some margin must be left for errors of observation. One of these seems to link up the fairy kingdom with spiritual communication, for the writer, Miss Winter of Blarney in Cork says, "We received communications from a fairy named Bebel several times, one of them lasting nearly an hour. The communication was as decided and swift as from the most powerful spirit. He told us that he was a leprechaun, but that in a ruined fort near us dwelt the pixies. Our domain had been the habitation of leprechauns always, and they, with their Queen Pycelle, mounted on her gorgeous dragonfly, found all they required in our grounds. He asked most lovingly about my little grandchildren, who visit us frequently, and since then he has been in the habit of communicating with them when we have yielded the table to them entirely, and just listened to the pure fun he and they were having together. He told them that the fairies find it quite easy to talk to the rabbits, and that they disliked the dogs because they chased them. They have great fun with the hens, on whose backs they ride, but they do not like them because they jeer at them. When he mentioned the old fort, I thought he referred to Blarney Castle, not far away, but on relating the incident to a farmer's daughter, whose family had been in the neighborhood for a very long time, she informed me that a laborer's cottage at the entrance to our avenue is built on the site of an old fort. Information absolutely new to us. A few more may be added to my list of witnesses, which might be greatly extended. Miss Hall of Bristol writes, "I too have seen fairies, but never until now have I dared to mention it for fear of ridicule. It was many years ago. I was quite a child of 6 or 7 years, and then, as now, passionately fond of all flowers, which always seemed to me living creatures. I was seated in the middle of a road in some cornfields, playing with a group of poppies, and never shall I forget my utter astonishment at seeing a funny little man playing hide and seek among these flowers to amuse me. I watched him for quite a long time, then he disappeared. He seemed a merry little fellow, but I cannot even remember his face. In color he was a sage green. His limbs were round and had the appearance of geranium stalks. He did not seem to be clothed, and was about 3 inches high and slender. I often looked for him again, but without success." Mr. J. Foote Young, the well-known water diviner, writes, "Some years ago I was one of a party invited to spend the afternoon on the lovely slopes of Oxford Hill in the county of Dorset. The absence of both trees and hedges in this locality enables one to see without obstruction for long distances. I was walking with my companion, who lives in the locality, some little distance from the main party, when to my astonishment I saw a number of what I thought to be very small children, about a score in number, and all dressed in little gaily colored short skirts, their legs being bare. Their hands were joined, and all held up as they merrily danced round in a perfect circle. We stood watching them, when in an instant they all vanished from our sight. My companion told me they were fairies, and that they often came to that particular part to hold their revels. It may be our presence disturbed them." Mrs. Ethel Enid Wilson of Worthing writes, "I quite believe in fairies. Of course, they are really nature spirits. I have often seen them on fine sunny days playing in the sea and riding on the waves, but no one I have ever been with at that time has been able to see them, excepting once my little nephews and nieces saw them too. They were like little dolls, quite small, with beautiful bright hair, and they were constantly moving and dancing about. Mrs. Rose of Southend-on-Sea told us in a chat on the subject, "I think I have always seen fairies. I see them constantly here in the shrubbery by the sea. They congregate under the trees and float around about the trees, and gnomes come around to protect them. The gnomes are like little old men with little green caps, and their clothes are generally neutral green. The fairies themselves are in light draperies. I have also seen them in the conservatory of my house, floating about among the flowers and plants. The fairies appear to be perpetually playing, except when they go to rest on the turf or in a tree, and I once saw a group of gnomes standing on each other's shoulders, like gymnasts on the stage. They seem to be living as much as I am. It is not imagination. I have seen the gnomes arranging a sort of moss bed for the fairies, just like a mother bird putting her chicks to bed. I don't hear any sounds from the gnomes or fairies, but they always look happy, as if they were having a really good time." Miss Eva Longbottom, LRAMARCM of Bristol, a charming vocalist who has been blind from birth, told us in an interview, "I have seen many fairies with my mind's eyes, that is, clairvoyantly. They are of various kinds, the ones I see. The music fairies are very beautiful. Argent describes them, for they make you think of silver, and they have dulcet, silvery voices. They speak and sing, but more in sound than in distinct words, a language of their own, a fairy tongue. Their music is a thing we cannot translate. It exists in itself. I don't think Mendelssohn has truly caught it, but Mr. Coleridge Taylor's music reminds me of the music I have heard from the fairies themselves. His fairy ballads are very charming. Then there are the dancing fairies. Their dancing is dainty and full of grace, a sweet old style of dance, without any tangles in it. I am generally alone when I see them, not necessarily in a woodland, but wherever the atmosphere is poetical. They are quite real. Another kind is the poem fairies. They are more ethereal and of a violet shade. If you could imagine Perdita in the Midsummer Night's Dream, translated from the stage into a real fairy, you would have a good idea of the poem fairy. She has a very beautiful, girlish character. The same might be said of Miranda, but she is more sentimental. The color fairies are also most interesting. If you can imagine each color transformed into a fairy, you may get an idea of what they are like. They are in airy forms and dance and sing in the tone of their colors. I have not seen any brownies, as I do not take so much interest in the domestic side of the fairy's life. When I was young, I had it so much impressed on me that fairies were imaginary beings that I would not believe in them. But when I was about 14, I began to realize them, and now I love them. Perhaps it was the deeper study of the arts that brought them to me. I have felt a sympathetic vibration for them, and they have made me feel that we were friends. I have had a great deal of happiness and good fortune in my life, and perhaps I can attribute some of that to the fairies. These last examples I owe to Mr. John Lewis, editor of the Psychic Gazette, who collected them. I think I may fairly claim that if all of them be added to those which I have quoted in my original article, and these again be linked up with the Cottingley children and photographs, we are in a position to present our case with some confidence to the public. Chapter 8. The Theosophic View of Fairies. Of all religions and philosophies in Western lands, I know none save that ancient teaching now called Theosophy, which has any place in it for elemental forms of life. Therefore, since we have established some sort of independent case for their existence, it is well that we should examine carefully what they teach and see how far it fits in with what we have been able to gather or to demonstrate. There is no one who has a better right to speak upon the point than my co-worker, Mr. E. L. Gardner, since he is both the discoverer of the fairies and a considerable authority upon theosophic teaching. I am glad, therefore, to be able to include some notes from his pen. For the most part, he writes, amid the busy commercialism of modern times, the fact of their existence has faded to a shadow, and a most delightful and charming field of nature study has too long been veiled. In this 20th century, there is promise of the world stepping out of some of its darker shadows. Maybe it is an indication that we are reaching the silver lining of the clouds when we find ourselves suddenly presented with actual photographs of these enchanting little creatures, relegated long since to the realm of the imaginary and fanciful. Now, what are the fairies? First, it must be clearly understood that all that can be photographed must of necessity be physical. Nothing of a subtler order could in the nature of things affect the sensitive plate. So-called spirit photographs, for instance, imply necessarily a certain degree of materialization before the form could come within the range even of the most sensitive of films. But well within our physical octave, there are degrees of density that elude ordinary vision. Just as there are many stars in the heavens recorded by the camera that no human eye has ever seen directly, so there is a vast array of living creatures whose bodies are of that rare tenuity and subtlety from our point of view that they lie beyond the range of our normal senses. Many children and sensitives see them, and hence our fairy lore, all founded on actual and now demonstrable fact. Fairies use bodies of a density that we should describe in non-technical language as of a lighter than gaseous nature. But we should be entirely wrong if we thought them in consequence unsubstantial. In their own way, they are as real as we are, and perform functions in connection with plant life of an important and most fascinating character. To hint at one phase, many a reader will have remarked on the lasting freshness and beauty of flowers cut and tended by one person, and on the other hand, their comparatively short life when in the care of another. The explanation is to be found in the kindly devotion of the one person and the comparative indifference of the other, which emotions affect keenly the nature spirits, in whose immediate care the flowers are. Their response to love and tenderness is quickly evidenced in their charges. Fairies are not born and do not die as we do, though they have their periods of outer activity and retirement. Allied to the Lepidoptera or butterfly genus of our familiar acquaintance, rather than to the mammalian line, they partake of certain characteristics that are obvious. There is little or no mentality awake, simply a gladsome, irresponsible joyousness of life that is abundantly in evidence in their enchanting abandon. The diminutive human form so widely assumed is doubtless due, at least in great measure, to the powerful influence of human thought, the strongest creative power in our cycle. In the investigations I have pursued in Yorkshire, the New Forest, and Scotland, many fairy lovers and observers have been interviewed and their accounts compared. In most cases, I was interested to note that my share in making public the photographs of Cottingley was the worst sort of introduction imaginable. Few fairy lovers have looked with favor on that. Reproaches have been frequent and couched in no measured terms, for the photographs have been resented as an unwarranted intrusion and desecration. Only after earnest assurances as to my own attitude could I get farther and obtain those intimate confidences that I have compared and checked and pieced together and am at liberty to narrate here. The function of the nature spirit of woodland, meadow, and garden, indeed in connection with vegetation generally, is to furnish the vital connecting link between the stimulating energy of the sun and the raw material of the form. The growth of a plant, which we regard as the customary and inevitable result of associating the three factors of sun, seed, and soil, would never take place if the fairy builders were absent. We do not obtain music from an organ by associating the wind, a composer's score, and the instrument. The vital link supplied by the organist, though he may be unseen, is needed, and similarly the nature spirits are essential to the production of the plant. The normal working body of the gnome and fairy is not of human nor of any other definite form, and herein lies the explanation of much that has been puzzling concerning the nature spirit kingdom generally. They have no clean-cut shape normally, and one can only describe them as small, hazy, and somewhat luminous clouds of color with a brighter spark-like nucleus. As such, they cannot be defined in terms of form, any more than one can so describe a tongue of flame. In such a body they fill their office, working inside the plant structure. Magnetic is the only word that can describe their method. Instantly responsive to stimulus, they appear to be influenced from two directions, the physical outer conditions prevailing, and an inner intelligent urge. These two influences determine their working activity. Some, and these are by far the most numerous, work on cell construction and organization, and are comparatively small when assuming the human form, being 2 to 3 inches high. Others are concerned exclusively with root development below ground, while others are apparently specialists in color and paint the flowers by means of the streaming motion of their cloud-like bodies. There appears to be little trace of any selective or discriminating work done individually. They all seem actuated by a common influence that affects them continuously, and which strongly suggests the same type of instinctive prompting that marks the bee and ant. Though the nature spirit must be regarded as practically irresponsible, living a gladsome, joyous, and delightfully untrammeled life, each member appears to possess at least a temporary definite individuality at times, and to rejoice in it. The diminutive human form, sometimes grotesque, as in the case of brownie and gnome, and sometimes beautifully graceful, as in the surface fairy variety, if conditions allow, is assumed in a flash. For a while it is retained, and it seems clear that the definite and comparatively concrete shape affords pleasure above the ordinary. There is no organization perceptible, as one might perhaps hastily infer. The content of the body still appears homogeneous, though somewhat denser, and the shape of human is usually only seen when not at work. The nature spirit so clothed indulges in active movement, in skipping and dancing gestures, and exhibits a gay abandon suggestive of the keenest delight in the experience. It is evidently time off and play for it, though its work seems charming enough. If disturbed or alarmed, the change back to the slightly subtler vehicle, the magnetic cloud, is as sudden as the birth. What determines the shape assumed and how the transformation is effected is not clear. One may speculate as to the influence of human thought, individual or in the mass, and quite probably the explanation when found will include this influence as a factor. But I am intent here not on theorizing, but on a narrative of observed happenings. One thing is clear, the nature spirit form is objective. Objective, that is, in the sense in which we apply that term to a stone, a tree, and a human body. The wings are a feature that one would hardly expect to find in conjunction with arms. In this respect, the insect type, with its several limbs and 2 or more wings, is a nearer model. But there is no articulation and no venation. And moreover, the wings are not used for flying. Streaming emanations is the only description one can apply. In some varieties, particularly the sylphs, the streamers surround the body as by a luminous aura sprayed to a feathery mist. I was told that the earlier and more elaborate Red Indian headdresses must have been inspired from this source, so suggestive are they, though the best of them are but poor copies of the originals. There is no food taken as we should regard it. Nourishment, usually abundant and ample for sustenance, is absorbed directly by a rhythmic breathing or pulse. Resource to the magnetic bath on occasion appears to be their only special restorative. The perfume of flowers is delighted in, and reversely disagreeable odors repel. This is one of many reasons, besides timidity, why human society is usually avoided, there being little that is inviting in that connection for them, and much that is obnoxious. Any estimate of length of life is misleading, because comparison with ourselves cannot be made. There is no real birth nor death as we understand the terms, simply a gradual emergence from and a return to a subtler state of being. This process takes some time, probably years in certain varieties, and their life on the denser level corresponding to our adult period may be as long as the average human. There is nothing definite in all this, however, except the fact of the gradual emergence and return. There is no sex as we should regard it, though so far as I can gather, there is division and subdivision of body at a much subtler and earlier level than that usually sensed. This process seems to correspond to the fission and budding of our familiar simple animals, with the addition towards the end of the cycle of fusion or reassembly into the larger unit. Below the sylph there appears to be nothing or very little in the way of a language of words. Communication is possible by inflection and gesture, much as the same can be exercised with domestic animals. Indeed, the relation of human with the lower nature spirits seems to be about on a par with that of kittens, puppies, and birds. Yet there is abundant evidence of a tone language among them. Music by pipe and flute is common, though to the human ear of the quaintest character. But whether the instrument or the voice is the real source, I cannot yet determine. The higher orders of nature spirits are adding mentality to the emotional development, and speech with them is possible. Their attitude to ordinary humanity is unfriendly rather than well-disposed, and often hostile, arising probably from our utter disregard of the amenities. I am beginning to see sense and reason in the burnt offerings of yore. Pollution of the atmosphere is a horror to the sylphs, and deeply resented. An ancient saying I had seen somewhere came to mind when discussing the beautiful air spirits and their work. Fire is the mouth of the gods. Our sanitary and burial customs are doubtless still capable of improvement. The dissection and examination of vegetable forms, however exhaustive, is but an analysis of effects. No adequate cause is therein to be found any more than a dissection of a sculpture will disclose the craftsman. The amazing skill in evidence in the plant kingdom, in construction, adaptation, and adornment, demands the labor of workman, mechanic, and artist. Their recognition in the nature spirits fills the vague hiatus between the sun's energy and the material wrought. On our own human side of the line, the finding of two pieces of wood nailed together would unmistakably point to a workman of sorts. Yet we are accustomed to gaze with wonder and admiration on the exquisitely built forms of a whole kingdom, and murmur evolutionary processes, or the hand of God, according to our temperament. An agent is necessary on the one side, and no less on the other. The feature that will appeal to every nature lover interested in the vital processes of plant life is the craftsmanship of the nature spirit agent. An inference, if it be simple enough, often escapes us, though in this case the experiences gathered of our own human labor suggest the analogy vividly. An analogy with a difference, however, for the hidden manner of work of the nature spirit is in most respects the exact opposite in character to our own. In this physical world, we labor with hands and tools and work consistently on exteriors, always indeed handling and applying our material from the outside. Addition, accretion is our constructive method. We find ourselves made that way, and it is our characteristic mode of approach. The nature spirits operate from the interior, working from a center outwards. Their aim appears to be to achieve an ever closer touch with the environment, and to that end the driving urge of their activity is how best to adapt the means to their hand. It is easy to perceive the cause of variety in nature in view of this striking endeavor to organize the vehicle that the nature spirits use, and so gain in endless ways a closer touch. Flower coloring, mimicry, seed protection and distribution, defensive and aggressive measures, all the 1,001 devices employed to attain an end, point to an intelligence working through agents who at their own level are often in more or less antagonistic relation with each other. Variety and difference is as much in evidence as among humanity, and makes for that diversity of form and custom that we find on our own side so fruitful of experience. In the tilling of the soil and the culture of plant life for our own purposes, we have worked intimately together, though unconsciously. The efforts of nature spirits working by themselves without our assistance produce the wild flowers and berries of our woodlands and meadows, while partnership with the human yields a record of cultivated cereal, flower, and fruit immensely richer. The relation of the nature spirit to the consciousness functioning through the vegetable kingdom generally is an interesting study too, for the twain appear quite separate. This might perhaps be likened to the role respectively of crew and passenger in a ship. The slumbering, or at best slowly awaking consciousness of the plant makes of it little more than an idle traveler, whereas the nature spirits, alert and active, attend to the upkeep and navigation of the craft, and the voyage through the kingdom means a growth and development for both. What might follow an intelligent understanding of the little people and the establishment of mutual good feeling opens up a prospect alluring in the extreme. It would be for us a working in the light instead of in darkness. A foretaste of such cooperation may be gathered by noting the effect of a devoted lover of flowers on his or her charges. The nature spirit responds to emotion and appears keenly appreciative of kindly attention and affection. Whether this applies with any force to any but the varieties concerned with flowers and fruits, I cannot say. But it certainly does to them, and the intelligent direction of effort in place of empirical incident tempts one's speculation to run riot as to future possibilities. The awakened self-consciousness of the human kingdom, with a vigorous mentality linked to kindly emotion and physical action, may enable an ages-old debt to be adjusted. We have served the nature spirit line of evolution consciously not at all, but by understanding the situation, we can cooperate together intelligently and helpfully, and the service of both to mutual advantage can take the place of blind experiment and groping self-interest. E. L. Gardner. In the literature of theosophy, I know no one who treats the elemental forces of nature more fully than Bishop Leadbeater, whom I met in my Australian travels, and who impressed me by his venerable appearance, his ascetic habits, and his claims to a remarkable clairvoyancy, which has, as he alleges, opened up many of the arcana. In his book, The Hidden Side of Things, he talks very fully of the fairies of many lands. Dealing with the little creatures whom so many of my informants have seen tending flowers, the seer says, "The little creatures that look after flowers may be divided into two great classes, though of course there are many varieties of each kind. The first class may properly be called elementals, for beautiful though they are in reality only thought forms, and therefore they are not really living creatures at all. Perhaps I should rather say that they are only temporary living creatures, for though they are very active and busy during their little lives, they have no real evolving, reincarnating life in them, and when they have done their work, they just go to pieces and dissolve into the surrounding atmosphere, precisely as our own thought forms do. They are the thought forms of the great beings or angels who are in charge of the evolution of the vegetable kingdom. When one of these great ones has a new idea connected with one of the kinds of plants or flowers which are under his charge, he often creates a thought form for the special purpose of carrying out that idea. It usually takes the form either of an etheric model of the flower itself, or of a little creature which hangs round the plant or the flower all through the time that the buds are forming, and gradually builds them into the shape and color of which the angel has thought. But as soon as the plant has fully grown, or the flower has opened, its work is over and its power is exhausted. And, as I have said, it just simply dissolves, because the will to do that piece of work was the only soul that it had. But there is quite another kind of little creature, which is very frequently seen playing about with flowers, and this time it is a real nature spirit. There are many varieties of these also. One of the commonest forms is, as I have said, something very much like a hummingbird, and it may often be seen buzzing round the flowers much in the same way as a hummingbird or a bee does. These beautiful little creatures will never become human, because they are not in the same line of evolution as we are. The life which is now animating them has come up through grasses and cereals, such as wheat and oats, when it was in the vegetable kingdom, afterwards through ants and bees when it was in the animal kingdom. Now it has reached the level of these tiny nature spirits, and its next stage will be to ensoul some of the beautiful fairies with etheric bodies who live upon the surface of the earth. Later on, they will become salamanders or fire spirits, and later still they will become sylphs or air spirits, having only astral bodies instead of etheric. Later still they will pass through the different stages of the great kingdom of the angels. Speaking of the national characteristics of fairies, he says with all the assurance of an actual observer, no contrast could well be more marked than that between the vivacious, rollicking orange and purple or scarlet and gold mannikins who dance among the vineyards of Sicily, and the almost wistful gray and green creatures who move so much more sedately amidst the oaks and furze-covered heaths in Brittany, or the golden brown good people who haunt the hillsides of Scotland. In England, the emerald green kind is probably the commonest, and I have seen it also in the woods in France and Belgium, in faraway Massachusetts, and on the banks of the Niagara River. The vast plains of the Dakotas are inhabited by a black and white kind which I have not seen elsewhere, and California rejoices in a lovely white and gold species which also appears to be unique. In Australia, the most frequent type is a very distinctive creature of a wonderful, luminous sky blue color, but there is a wide diversity between the etheric inhabitants of New South Wales or Victoria and those of tropical northern Queensland. These latter approximate closely to those of the Dutch Indies. Java seems especially prolific in these graceful creatures, and the kinds most common there are two distinct types, both monochromatic, one indigo blue with faint metallic gleamings, and the other a study in all known shades of yellow, quaint but wonderfully effective and attractive. A striking local variety is gaudily ringed with alternate bars of green and yellow, like a football jersey. This ringed type is probably a race peculiar to that part of the world, for I saw red and yellow similarly arranged in the Malay Peninsula, and green and white on the other side of the straits in Sumatra. That huge island also rejoices in the possession of a lovely pale heliotrope tribe, which I have seen before only in the hills of Ceylon. Down in New Zealand, their specialty is a deep blue shot with silver, while in the South Sea Islands one meets with silvery white variety, which coruscates with all the colors of the rainbow like a figure of mother of pearl. In India we find all sorts, from the delicate rose and pale green, or pale blue and primrose of the hill country, to the rich medley of gorgeously gleaming colors, almost barbaric in their intensity and profusion, which is characteristic of the plains. In some parts of that marvelous country, I have seen the black and gold type, which is more usually associated with the African desert, and also a species which resembles a statuette made out of a gleaming crimson metal, such as was the orichalcum of the Atlanteans. Somewhat akin to this last is a curious variety which looks as though cast out of bronze and burnished. It appears to make its home in the immediate neighborhood of volcanic disturbances, since the only places in which it has been seen so far are the slopes of Vesuvius and Etna, the interior of Java, the Sandwich Islands, the Yellowstone Park in North America, and a certain part of the North Island of New Zealand. Several indications seem to point to the conclusion that this is a survival of the primitive type, and represents a sort of intermediate stage between the gnome and the fairy. In some cases, districts close together are found to be inhabited by quite different classes of nature spirits. For example, as has already been mentioned, the emerald green elves are common in Belgium, yet 100 miles away in Holland, hardly one of them is to be seen, and their place is taken by a sober-looking dark purple species. Very interesting indeed is his account of the Irish fairies. Speaking of a sacred mountain in Ireland, Leadbeater says, "A curious fact is that altitude above the sea level seems to affect their distribution. Those who belong to the mountains scarcely ever intermingling with those of the plains. I well remember when climbing one of the traditionally sacred hills of Ireland, noticing the very definite lines of demarcation between the different types. The lower slopes, like the surrounding plains, were alive with the intensely active and mischievous little red and black race, which swarms all over the south and west of Ireland, being especially attracted to the magnetic centers established nearly 2,000 years ago by the magic-working priests of the old Milesian race to ensure and perpetuate their dominance over the people by keeping them under the influence of the great illusion. After half an hour's climbing, however, not one of these red and black gentry was to be seen, but instead the hillside was populous with the gentler blue and brown type, which long ago owed special allegiance to the Tuatha De Danann. These also had their zone and their well-defined limits, and no nature spirit of either type ever ventured to trespass upon the space round the summit, sacred to the great green angels who have watched there for more than 2,000 years, guarding one of the centers of living force that link the past to the future of that mystic land of Erin. Taller far than the height of man, these giant forms, in color like the first new leaves of spring, soft, luminous, shimmering, indescribable, look forth over the world with wondrous eyes that shine like stars, full of the peace of those who live in the eternal, waiting with the calm certainty of knowledge until the appointed time shall come. One realizes very fully the power and importance of the hidden side of things when one beholds such a spectacle as that. For fuller information, the reader may well be referred to the original, published by the Theosophical Publishing House. The book is a storehouse of knowledge upon all occult matters, and certainly the details concerning the fairies fit in remarkably well with the information from other sources. I have now laid before the reader the full circumstances in connection with the 5 successful photographs taken at Cottingley. I have added the experience of a clairvoyant officer in the company of the girls upon the 3rd and unsuccessful attempt to get photographs. I have analyzed some of the criticism which we have had to meet. I have given the reader the opportunity of judging the evidence for a considerable number of alleged cases collected before and after the Cottingley incident. Finally, I have placed before him the general theory of the place in creation of such creatures, as defined by the only system of thought which has found room for them. Having read and weighed all this, the investigator is in as strong a position as Mr. Gardner or myself, and each must give his own verdict. I do not myself contend that the proof is as overwhelming as in the case of spiritualistic phenomena. We cannot call upon the brightest brains in the scientific world, the Crooks, the Lodges, or the Lombrosos for confirmation, but that also may come, and for the present, while more evidence will be welcome, there is enough already available to convince any reasonable man that the matter is not one which can be readily dismissed. but that a case actually exists which up to now has not been shaken in the least degree by any of the criticism directed against it. Far from being resented, such criticism, so long as it is earnest and honest, must be most welcome to those whose only aim is the fearless search for truth. And with that, we have at last reached the end of The Coming of the Fairies by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I hope you enjoyed this very fascinating look into the way our minds work to confirm ideas we dearly want to believe. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the photographs, which I highly recommend that you do, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, leave a comment on doing multiple episodes from a single work in a row, or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read. The best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod, or you can send me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.